There's a black book that Jeffrey Epstein has. I don't know if he has a black book or not, but this is what Kash Patel said. It's under the direct control of the FBI director. It's outrageous that they won't release it, and that should be released on day one. We're on day 100 and whatever. Why hasn't Kash Patel released that?
So recently, Glenn Greenwald had a podcast where he's talking about the lingering questions in the Epstein case and the Trump administration's response to them. This has recently come back up in the news because Kash Patel and Dan Bongino both were in a sit-down interview and said that they believe that Epstein killed himself. So this is going to be interesting. I can't wait to hear what Glenn says about this because he's covered this story extensively. So let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
The more people learned about the extent of his degenerate sex trafficking and use of minors for sexual pleasure, how many elites and powerful people were associated with Jeffrey Epstein, friends with him, traveled on his plane with him, went to that island with him, the more people began to question, like, what is this? Like, why is this known pedophile, someone who was convicted back in 2010 for having sex with minors and got a sweetheart deal, which I think is very important, a deal like unimaginably generous. Why is someone like that so embraced in so many elite circles? And when Jeffrey Epstein finally was arrested, and people thought he was finally going to be put on trial, we were finally going to have transparency, and instead he ended up dying with the prison claiming that he committed suicide. A lot of people were understandably doubtful about that because you're talking about a high profile prisoner in a federal prison. And understandably, people were skeptical of the claim that he actually committed suicide. People thought, well, I think there's a good possibility that he was probably murdered.
Yeah, his cell, if you look at the pictures of it, there is essentially two kind of nooses in there. There was a broken bone in his neck that does not generally happen when you're hanging yourself. The prison guards supposedly fell asleep and they had never really fallen asleep before, had been reprimanded for doing that. The cameras mysteriously didn't work at that exact moment. There's so many crazy things that it just makes the idea that he didn't commit suicide. It just, there's no way that he killed himself. And the entire American public just looks at this and laughs because of how absurd it is, especially because Kash Patel and Dan Bongino sung very different tunes before they got into power.
And among the people who have been suggesting that and raising that very vocally for many years are Kash Patel, who was a conservative pundit, somebody who had worked in the government, was very admired among the American right. And also Dan Bongino, who became one of the most popular pundits anywhere. And at some point, we're going to find the video for you, a stash of it. She called a bunch of conservative influencers and commentators to the White House. They all raved around the Epstein files, part 1. And as it turned out, it was a complete debacle and humiliation because there wasn't a single document in this binder that hadn't already been made publicly available through reporting, through trials, through all kinds of process. Not a single document, no revelations.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest optics disasters of the Trump administration so far, is actually acting like these Epstein files volume 1 was, something to be shared and to be celebrated when all those documents had already been released in a different form before. So Glenn's entirely right about that. And we now know that, some people close to the administration, Pam Bondi, have had interviews saying, hey, we're reviewing these files. And it's been, how long has it been? It's been like 5 years later of reviewing these files and tapes. And the tapes of prominent people at Epstein Island are known to exist. Epstein is documented to have had an extensive surveillance system on his property, capturing video of prominent people, presumably in compromising situations on discs that were labeled. And people just talk about the client list. But this is what's tangible.
And so then people started to ask, wait a minute, what's going on here? Like, what you repeatedly, vocally promised, all of you who were inside the Trump administration, that you would release the Epstein files. Like, what's going on? Where are they? And this got inflamed this week because of comments by Kash Patel and Dan Bongino when they went on Fox News and were asked explicitly, did Jeffrey Epstein kill himself? And this is what they said.
You said Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide. People don't believe it.
Well, I mean, listen, they have a right to their opinion, but as someone who has worked as a public defender, as a prosecutor, who's been in that prison system, who's been in the Metropolitan Detention Center, who's been in segregated housing, you know a suicide when you see one, and that's what that was.
Yeah, cameras that suddenly don't work. Check, suicide. Guards that mysteriously fall asleep. Check, suicide. Broken bone that doesn't indicate a hanging. Check, suicide. This is crazy, and this was not the same sorts of arguments he was making in the run-up to Trump's election. He was, in several interviews, being skeptical about that and calling for the actual release of more files and information related to the Epstein sex ring.
He killed himself. Again, you want me to get... I've seen the whole file. He killed himself.
Now, you can make your own judgments about their body posture, their demeanor, or whatever. I particularly don't think they looked entirely comfortable, but that might just be because they know that their most ardent supporters don't believe Jeffrey Epstein killed himself.
That's for sure.
Are going to want to see the proof. They're saying, we read the file. Well, why haven't we read the file? Why haven't we, the public, seen the file? If there's such definitive evidence that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself, and it convinced you, where is that?
Yeah, when Alan Dershowitz is recently in the news, raising skepticism that Epstein killed himself, and Epstein was known to have covered for Dershowitz, you know that there's something wrong with this narrative going on here. This is just ludicrous, and for these two to say this is just indicative of the whole problem with Washington. Once these populists that talk about being transparent and releasing information and cracking down on the criminals get into office, they sure do change their tunes very quickly, it sure seems like.
And it's particularly notable because, as I said, both Dan Bongino and Kash Patel have been along raising the questions that other people have. Here, for example, is Dan Bongino speaking to Tim Pool on his podcast in May of 2023.
About a year and a half after that, I'm in a green room at Fox, and I'm not going to say who because they didn't give me permission to share it, but the short story, but I don't know who they are. It says, Epstein's an intelligence asset for people in the Middle East, right? I'm like, no, I didn't know that.
Okay, I have to stop there and just pause it because they can never specify on this point. They always leave the door open. Intelligence asset for people in the Middle East. You can say it. Just say Israel. That's the most prominent. I'm sure that this talk show, personality he talked to was more specific than that and didn't say Middle East unless he's parroting the same line to protect for Israel. Epstein had multiple connections to the Israeli government, not only in terms of Les Wexner, who gave him hundreds of millions of dollars and was connected to the Israeli government, and Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, who certainly was working for Mossad and certainly had connections to Israel. So you can just say it, Dan. You can just say Israel.
And I'm like, you sure of that? The person, let's say, is like, I'm absolutely sure of that he's either a witting or unwitting asset, intelligence asset, meaning his plane and that island, the cameras, there's a big assumption out there that these videotapes were exclusively in the custody of Epstein. That's a huge mistake. The reason they wanted this story to go away is because there's an assumption like, oh yeah, Epstein had him. No, he wasn't the only one who had him, according to this source. These assets, that's why this blackmail story makes so much sense. Which Middle Eastern countries they are, I don't know, but
Yeah, you probably do know. I mean, even back then, this was a few years ago. I'm just going to guess that the person he was talking to was Tucker Carlson. I don't know that for sure. That's just my guess. But they're going to just use this, and if this clip is repeated, they're going to bring it up and be like, oh, it could be Qatari. It could be Qatari intelligence. It's just bogus. There's nothing plausible outside of his connection to Mossad or the U.S. intelligence services. It's crazy to suggest it's so open to interpretation here when all the breadcrumbs are there. There might not be a smoking gun, but there are breadcrumbs.
this person who is a very, very good reporter, I mean, aces, right, swore Epstein was either a witting or unwitting intelligence asset, and they may have had his plane wired up, and they're the ones who have all this stuff. So the point is, to sum it up, how do you know some of these countries aren't going to some of these power players who aren't making decisions? Because, hey, you wouldn't want this video out there, right? How do you know?
100%.
I mean,
I could not agree more with everything Dan Bongino said there.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of interest in the quote-unquote client list, and reporters who have followed this case very closely, who have been very intrepid, will tell you the client list has been long known. The people who have visited the island is long known. But maybe there's information about other people who were his clients, because it is true he was guilty of sex trafficking, and yet there's nobody to whom he trafficked these minors who has been convicted.
Yeah, that's right. In some ways, I think the client list is a red herring, and actually the regime wants that to keep being brought up because it is maybe a total dead end, because the people that deserve to be convicted for having these underage women, girls being sex trafficked to them are not ever going to be divulged. But Glenn's right. The more serious questions are, what's on the tapes? And did he have connections to intelligence services? It seems like he did, or at least it's a very plausible scenario that he did, and people aren't talking about that to the same extent. Same with what's on those tapes, which are known to exist.
But what Dan Bongino said was the key question there. I totally agree is the key question. Like, that's the one that interests me most. Obviously, if there were elites having sex with minors furnished by Jeffrey Epstein, I want to know that. But the question I really think we need the answer to is exactly what Dan Bongino said there, that people have been talking about for a long time. Did Jeffrey Epstein work with or for foreign intelligence agents?
Yeah.
Foreign intelligence agencies. Was this some kind of scam to lure elites into compromising positions so the foreign intelligence agencies could have that on them? Compromising information? It's always been a question like, where did Jeffrey Epstein's vast wealth come from? I mean, he wasn't just very rich. He was buying $30 and $40 million homes in New York City and West Palm Beach and that private island and flying around on private jets. I mean, he was living like a multi-billionaire.
Yeah, he lived in lavish wealth, and it's pretty unexplainable because he had a very short stint as, I believe, a math teacher, didn't perform well, and kind of was forced to resign, or he left under his own accord. Then he became kind of a tax specialist and somehow crossed paths with Les Wexner, and apparently did such a good job that Wexner just heaved him hundreds of millions of dollars, and from there, he just lived a lavish lifestyle, and it's really not clear where he ran into more of his wealth or how he got to it. It's really unexplainable unless he was connected to foreign intelligence or some organization of that kind.
Even though there's nothing ever known that he really did that would give him that kind of wealth. So then the question becomes, why don't we know the answer to that question? I believe, Pam Bondi said last week when asked about this, we have so many tapes of Jeffrey Epstein having sex with minors, thousands of them, and that takes time to go through.
Red herring.
No one wants to see those. No one is interested in those. Jeffrey Epstein having sex with minors. We know he had sex with minors. Everybody knows that.
Yeah, what's on the other tapes? Who's on the other tapes that you haven't prosecuted at all? You've only prosecuted Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein himself. He didn't get to trial. He killed himself. But these people in this sex ring were charged with trafficking to no one. And that's what people have questions about. The clients list is significant, but it is a red herring compared to what's in this evidence, what's on the tapes, and did he have connections to intelligence services, and in particular, Israel, the one that Bongino didn't want to say, the one that Kash Patel doesn't want to say. And by the way, Kash Patel is a huge advocate of closer relations with Israel, so that might not be that surprising.
Or like go through the videos, but those should be the last priority. Like that's not an excuse for refusing to release information on this question. Why were there foreign intelligence agencies involved with Jeffrey Epstein? Or as Dan Bongino said, maybe they compromised him. Maybe they had a plane wired. Maybe they got information at his home video. We should know this. This is a crucial question. And it's long been suggested that he was working, as Dan Bongino said, with a Middle East foreign intelligence agency. Could be Qatar, could be the Saudis, could be Israel. And so why don't we know that? And like as we don't know that, you have both of them sitting there just like very kind of tightly wound saying, he killed himself, believe us. We can't show you what we know, even though we promised to do so, but believe us. He killed himself. Here's Kash Patel speaking to Glenn Beck in December of 2023.
Who has Jeffrey Epstein's
Black Book?
Black Book?
FBI.
But who? That is that. I mean, there's.
That's under direct control of the director of the FBI. Just like the manifesto from the Nashville school shooting of the Catholic school.
Yeah.
We still haven't seen that, right? It's not the Nashville police or PD saying we don't want this out. The FBI airmailed into that operation and said this is not getting out. Because they do that because this is another government gangster operation. All these local law enforcement communities get funding from the DOJ and FBI for local programs. And if you don't cooperate, you're not getting your $1 million for this, and you're not getting and that's a lot of money to these local districts. That's how they play the game. That's why you don't have a Black Book. Or the manifesto.
But the Black Book, it's not just sitting. I mean, that's Hoover power times 10.
And to me, that's a thing I think President Trump should run on. On day one, roll out the Black Book. And not just that. On day one, roll out all of the text messaging communications we were told were deleted. On day one, play the rest of the video of the pipe bomber. On day, one of the reforms I talk about in government gangsters is you need a central node to be continuously declassifying. This is another thing they do. They overclassify. And I'm telling you, as a former number 2 in the IC, they overclassify 50% of the stuff there to protect the deep state. Oh, no, you can't see that. Nothing to see here. Gina was a master at it, of doing it. And we still haven't seen half of the Russiagate report that we wrote. Still under lock and key. On how the ICA was originally constructed. We put 10,000 man-hours against John Brennan's team that did it. And we found out why they came up with their bogus conclusion. But we couldn't sell it to the world because we couldn't talk about it, and the government gangsters came in and buried it. All of these things, there needs to be a continuing central power, whether it's the White House or offsite, that says every request that comes in.
All right, keep in mind, he said that the Epstein Black Book is under the direct control of the director of the FBI. That was his complaint, saying that, that's why it hasn't gotten out. Well, who is the director of the FBI now, Kash? And where is this Black Book? And for him to harangue the deep state for covering up its tracks for itself, it sure seems like that's happening in the deep state after the transition of power from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. It sure seems like the uniparty and the bureaucratic class is still in control. And when you're out there kind of going totally against the angles that you went in the run-up to it, it just makes you look worse for it.
Isn't it so notable how different people sound when they're out of power and are just going around on the pundit shows or just being an activist? and then they get to Washington and they get into power and they just sound like completely different people. It reminds me of,
Yes.
and we talked about this before, how Mike Johnson, before he was speaker, when he was just kind of a backbench member of Congress, I had him on my show because he had very vehemently denounced the FBI director for abusing spying powers, for abusing FISA. And he came on my show and he talked about the urgent need to reform FISA. It can't be renewed. Gives the FBI too much power with no safeguards. I was like, God, I love Mike Johnson. He's really taken up this cause. He really understands it. And then he becomes speaker, and within like weeks, he's not only lifting his opposition to the renewal of the FISA bill with no reforms, he's leading the way and ensuring and shepherding the FISA bill to passage with no reforms, the exact opposite of what he had been saying for so long. And then when people asked him, like, what's going on? Like, what? You've been saying this for so long, the FISA bill can't be passed without major reforms, and now suddenly you're the leader in trying to get it passed with no reforms? And he's like, yeah, I was taken to a secret briefing, and the CIA showed me why this law is so important, it can't have reforms, and I believe them. So now I'm in favor.
You should never believe the CIA. It will fabricate whatever evidence it needs for you to vote in a particular direction, and it's always more aid for Israel, more regime change operations, more psyops on the American people, and more crap like MK Ultra and all the absurd programs that it has facilitated over the years.
Everything Kash Patel said there is absolutely right. And notice he said, there's a black book that Jeffrey Epstein has. I don't know if he has a black book or not, but this is what Kash Patel said. It's under the direct control of the FBI director. It's outrageous that they won't release it, and that should be released on day one. We're on day 100 and whatever. Why hasn't Kash Patel released that? This is 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think the sad answer to Glenn's question is because it's known within the government that Epstein did have connections to foreign intelligence or domestic intelligence, either the CIA or Mossad, most likely. That's the most plausible, given his own history, his own background, and his own connections. And the only way I can explain this, and Kash Patel's change in tune, outside of just base Washington rank hypocrisy, which we do see so much of from both sides of the political aisle, is that Kash Patel is a rabid Zionist. He gave an interview in December of 2024 where he said the American people need to, quote, wake up and prioritize Israel, as if that had never happened prior to December 2024. That's just so absurd, and both sides of the political aisle prioritize Israel far more than individual American states, like what happened in that train crash in Ohio and the natural disasters in North Carolina. Which country's gotten more foreign aid since its inception in 1948 than any other country? It's Israel. Israel's gotten about $340 billion since that time. So for Kash Patel to sit here and change his tune completely, it very much seems to indicate that there is known confirmation of Epstein's connections with intelligence, and that's what's being, played as a political football and decided as the justification to continue covering up for this nonsense.
And more importantly, why don't we know whether he worked with or foreign intelligence agencies? That is something that Kash Patel, Dan Bongino, Pam Bondi could easily know. And that's the only thing that gives me suspicion about the extraordinary delays they're claiming they need in releasing these documents, as well as the bizarre excuses they're offering, like we have thousands of tapes of Jeffrey Epstein having sex with minors. Feel free to go look at them on your own time whenever you want. But in the meantime, give us the relevant information. That's not an excuse for holding that up.
Right. It's such a, it's a throwaway answer. It's just a tactic to deflect.
Here is Alan Dershowitz, who of course was Jeffrey Epstein's lawyer, talking to Benny Johnson. This is just yesterday, I believe.
The reason I'm asking is because the entire internet was pretty shocked when Kash Patel and Dan Bongino said, no, he definitely killed himself in the prison cell, and you're saying that you believe that this was possible. You have been a skeptic about the official Epstein story for a long time.
have been. I'm not a skeptic about the fact that he didn't do it alone. He could not have simply killed himself alone. If he killed himself, it was with the assistance of some guards. And some guards have been disciplined for turning off their videos and for other actions that allowed him to kill himself. But it wouldn't surprise me if somebody managed to get into the prison and kill him, because I don't understand what his motive would have been. He could have killed himself at any time. And if he was going to be let out on bail, then why would he kill himself? So I've always had my doubts, my questions, but it's certainly plausible that he may have killed himself.
This is interesting, especially because Alan Dershowitz was so close to Epstein, and yet he is expressing at least some skepticism toward the official narrative. Now, lots of allegations have him engaged in misconduct with underage sex workers on Epstein Island, but this is still telling in terms of what it means. This guy was really close to Epstein, and he's going against the official Epstein narrative.
Yeah, that's what I think. Maybe he killed himself. People do kill themselves, and when they're actually in prison and facing that hardcore reality that they're likely to be in prison for the rest of their lives, I can understand suicide as an option. I don't really understand quite how we don't have, especially with the highest profile defendants with the highest suicide risk, obviously, in a federal prison, not some state prison or local prison, how you can't prevent prisoners from killing themselves. That seems odd to me. But obviously Alan Dershowitz thinks it's odd too. But again, I'm willing to believe that. I just want to see I think we should see what convinced Kash Patel after all this time he went around saying that it wasn't true. Now here's, I think we have another one from Alan Dershowitz here that's also from yesterday, and he addresses this question of whether Jeffrey Epstein worked for or with foreign intelligence agencies.
I was told that Epstein belonged to Intel and to leave it alone. And this is what Acosta said before.
That's the U.S. attorney from Miami who gave Jeffrey Epstein an insanely light plea deal given the accusations against him. You think serial pedophiles are often offered like 6 months in prison and 6 months on release with community service requirements? And the U.S. attorney in Miami, when asked about this much later on, like, why did you give him a deal like that? He said, I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone.
And that's one of the most damning things in this whole thing. He was in the Department of Justice handling these negotiations, and he divulged this. But almost no one in the corporate media talks about it. Thankfully, Glenn is. But this is a strong indication that he was, in fact, an intelligence asset, if not for Mossad, for the CIA or other three-letter agencies in the U.S.
And he worked in the Justice Department. That by itself makes his question urgent and credible.
Yeah.
Or a Senate committee looking to confirm him in the first Trump term. Can you expound on that? Could you unpack that for us?
Yeah, I would be shocked if that were true. Jeffrey Epstein was not a reliable person. I can't imagine that any intelligence service would be using him, but I've heard the claim. I heard the claim that the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agents, used him just the way they used Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Maxwell. And, you never know. One thing about intelligence services, they act in secret. So you never know. But I can't imagine any thoughtful intelligence service using a guy like Jeffrey Epstein. But it's certainly possible. If so, I didn't know anything about it. In fact,
well, this is crazy because Alan Dershowitz is one of Epstein's closest associates and by many accounts closest friends. So for him to say that he wasn't reliable seems very convenient now when he spent countless hours with Epstein, not just in services to him for legal services, but it seemed like the two were incredibly close in general.
No, I don't think it's that surprising that Alan Dershowitz, in the face of rumors that the Mossad was involved with Jeffrey Epstein, would want to say, I doubt it. I can't even imagine how that might be happening. All right, let's just see the documents on that. Let's see the information and the evidence on that. Now, we've talked about before, we did this show in March, which you can go look at, where we delved into the Jeffrey Epstein question. I'm not sure if this is the right one. It doesn't suggest that in the title, but there is one that we did that we'll put the link to. It could be this one. But in any event, we delved into all these important aspects of Jeffrey Epstein. Like I was suggesting before, where did his wealth come from? He was a extremely close associate to this multi-billionaire, Les Wexner, who is a major funder of Zionist causes, very closely linked to the Israeli government. And he provided Jeffrey Epstein with a lot of his wealth. And then Alan Dershowitz alluded to the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell, who's been convicted for being the key right-hand man of Jeffrey Epstein, her father, Robert Maxwell, who was a media baron and died under mysterious causes, he slipped off a boat, that he was heavily involved in Israeli intelligence, the Mossad. There's no question about that. So you have, maybe it's not Israeli intelligence, maybe it's Qatari intelligence, maybe it's Saudi intelligence. Let's see these records. Of course the government has information on that. And the fact that all these people were so gung-ho in demanding the release of this information, this exact information when they were out of government, got into government based on a promise to release it all, and now come up with nothing but excuses as to why they can't, obviously fuels those suspicions for any rational person far more than before.
Yeah, absolutely. Glenn is right on the mark here, as he is in so many ways on so many other stories. Glenn is always more charitable and kind of open-minded about different possibilities and different angles of certain stories than I would be in some regards, like to suggest, hey, is it Qatari intelligence? But hey, that's one of the reasons why we love Glenn. He's a great reporter, a great journalist, really one of the only great journalists of our time if you look at journalism in terms of how it affects the way people process information. He's not a corporate media shill, and he didn't even withstand The Intercept trying to suppress him from releasing Hunter Biden laptop stuff. But anyways, if Kash Patel and Dan Bongino and Trump are serious about this whole Epstein files thing, they just have to release the information. No more excuses, no more deflections, no more saying it's taking, 5 years to review the tapes that people don't even want. People want the information on the clients, what's on the tapes, who these victims were sex trafficked to, and whether Epstein had intelligence connections. That's what we want to know. So for them to turn face now, it just makes them seem complicit with the Washington swamp, the same Washington swamp they always decried during the campaign season before they were in power. And it sure seems like there's a lot of continuity between the Biden deep state and the Trump deep state in many regards. And that's unfortunate because the American people deserve more answers on this. It's been covered up just like JFK was for so many years, redacting information about that. One of the greatest things that the Trump administration did was release those files. I'm glad that he did that. But here's a chance to really show and expose the evil of this sex ring and sex trafficking operation that was covered up and reached into the highest levels of government. I think we know why that information won't be released and why we never may in our lifetime see it, because the U.S. government and some of its actors were complicit in it. That's what I think. But I do want to hear from you guys. What do you think is the most plausible reason we haven't gotten these Epstein files? Let me know in the comments down below. And please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll see you in the next one.